And welcome to this, our 127th live stream. Pyramid of the Puppet Pharaohs. This is a reference, of course, to our 15 pyramid myths video that came out on Monday, and we hope you enjoyed that video and found that interesting. So here we are again on Friday night, Saturday in some places, to take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. And the rules are the same as they always are, which is super chats have priority. That's true across all YouTube platforms, so that should be a surprise to no one. But we also take non-super chats. And if you are going to direct a question to me, we ask that you put a Q and a colon in front of it, so I know it's directed to me, because I do scan through the live chat. We also ask that you only post the question once. And we ask that if it has to do with a reference in the Bible, please include where it's found. Like, don't let me do the hunting for you, okay? So include the book of the Bible, the chapter, and the verse. Okay, if it has to do with a foreign language, we ask that you include what you think the word means and what language it's from. So those are the rules, and we'll get right into the non-super chats, and we're going to start the night with 3 non-super chats. Okay. Our first non-super chat here is actually from Daduza Dude. And he asks, is there an Egyptian version of Lilith? She is found all over the Middle East. Okay. Well, sort of. The idea, well, let's first explain what Lilith is. Lilith is a component of Talmudic, I would say, Second Temple period leading to Talmudic myth. Okay. Now, there is a reference to a Lilith in Isaiah, and that seems to be a reference to what we call a night demon. And some have speculated that Lilith is a rename of a Mesopotamian, basically, mother of demons. But that linguistic connection has been hotly contested. So, it's probably not derived from a Mesopotamian deity, but it's probably derived just from the word night, which is Lila. So it's probably a feminization of Lila to basically be a night demon of sorts. Okay? Now, with that said, is there an Egyptian version of Lilith? Well, the short answer is no. There's the problem with Egyptian religion, or I should say the feature of Egyptian religion, is all its conceptions of deity are dualistic. So, there's no such thing as sort of a pure evil entity in Egyptian religion. It doesn't exist. But what you have is every god in Egypt has 2 sides. It has a good coming and a bad coming. So as long as you're on the good side of whatever deity you're dealing with, you're okay. So you're not going to get a version of this where it's sort of the mother of demons. Now, second of all, that reading of Lilith is actually very, very late in Hebrew myth. It's almost all of it. Most scholars will agree now that the final form of this, where she's like the mother, or she's the first wife of Adam, she disobeys him, and then she has relations with demons to become the mother of many demons. Okay. That interpretation is definitely in the Anno Domini period. It's after Christ. So it's more of a late advent to Hebrew mythology. Even though the origin of the night demon herself goes back to the 8th century. So it's one of those things where it kind of developed over time, but it became more associated once you had the Jewish diaspora. Once you had the Jewish diaspora and they're starting to put together the Talmud, then they start formulating this myth. So, and it's possible that this myth was earlier than the Talmud, but at the same time too, it doesn't seem to be, we don't have any evidence for it so far. Except for that one, as I say, one reference in Isaiah. And that reference in Isaiah doesn't just give us very much. Ooh. 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 There's a cultural reference. Andrew Graham says, Lilith was also the second wife of Frasier on Cheers. That was a hilarious message. Oh, I'm sure that was intentional. But yeah, it's the etymology seems to come from the word meaning night. So that's why, say, for example, in the ESV, they translate it as night demon. So anyway, thank you for that question, and I hope that helped. Okay, our second question tonight is from Let Me Explain, followers of the shepherd. And he asks, did Moses have horns, or does it mean his face shone? Exodus 34:33 to 35. All right. I will read here from the NASB. Exodus 34. $33.35. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever Moses went before the Lord to speak with him, he would take off the veil until he came out. And whenever he came out and spoke to the sons of Israel what he had been commanded, the sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone. So Moses would replace the veil over his face until he went in to speak with him. Okay. Now, that what's the issue here is that word shone. I'm going to highlight that. See it? And it's the word keren. Now, keren can mean to shine, like we find in Habakkuk 3, verse 4. But it also can mean horns, like the horns on an animal, the horns on a horned altar. In fact, I wrote an article on this. So it can mean both. It's part of its lexical range. Now, how the horn interpretation gained traction was that Jerome translated keren here into horns. So that sort of mistranslations had traction in Western Christianity. So that's how it appears in, say, our older translations. Newer translations have replaced this with shine. Okay? So that's what we're finding right now in newer translations. Now, there is actually one real plausible argument to translate this as horn, which is when we look at, say, comparative material of, say, the iconography of kings, like, Ramses or Naram Sin. They're often portrayed as having horns on their crown. So, frankly, these animal characteristics are often applied to kings. One of the things we like, for example, if you look at most of the reliefs of pharaohs, they all have a tail. They have an ox tail. Okay? But that's part of the iconography here, is to show the strength and the power of the king having horns and these features of animals. So the idea here that Moses is coming out of the tent of meeting and being symbolically compared to a mighty animal that has horns, like a king, like say Naram Sin. That's what I think is it's a plausible reading. It's a plausible reading, just as long as you're not reading it literally. Okay? So I think in that case, that's a completely plausible reading. So yeah, I could go either way on this. Either shine as like for example in Habakkuk, or that symbolic horn meaning. I think that has some legs. So I think you could go either way on this. I think the only direction you really can't go is with a literal interpretation of this as being like horns. Okay? So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. Well, we'll probably pass on that for now. All right, let's get to the third non-super chat here, which is $7.19. There. Is from Seth Davidson. Okay. Right. All right. Seth asks, does the etymology of the names in Genesis tell us anything about the time or people that Genesis refers to? Not really. They're very vague. We don't even know what all those names in Genesis mean. So it doesn't tell us too much, not as much as we'd like. I mean, there's people who've tried to make things out of some of the names, but there's really not anything solid there. Example, Seth in Hebrew, but Seth is also an Egyptian god, asking for a friend. All right, let's take your example here. The example here is actually more interesting. Because they're not the same. They're not the same. They're only the same in English. Okay? They're only the same in English. So, the in Hebrew, it starts with a sheen. A sheen and it ends with a tape. So it's shet. Okay? But we translate that as Seth. It's easier for English people to say. Okay? But Seth in Egyptian is actually Setek. It has a sibilant S, a T, and a hate, a round H. So there's actually should be spoken as two syllables. So it's either Setek, Sutek, Setka, one of those variations. But this is why you see it often pronounced as Sutek or Setek. Because there's actually supposed to be a vowel between the T and the H. Okay? So, not the same at all. I know there are what's it called now? Mythicists out there that want to say they're the same, but they're not. They're not etymologically related at all. So, I don't know if you find that to be cool or not. Maybe you want to be identified with the Egyptian god of thunder and storms, but I mean, I think Sutek is of the Egyptian gods. He's a really cool god. Okay, he's one of my favorite Egyptian gods. But the two are not related in any way. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you for the question, and very much appreciate it. Okay, that's our 3 non-super chats for the start of the night. We'll resume with more at the end of the night. But let's now get into the super chats. And our first one here is from Addison Weir. And he asks, would the biblical authors have embraced the idea of God's absolute immutability, for example, unchangeability, as defended by Aristotle and Aquinas? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's really no question that they would have supported that position. Let's see here. There is one verse in particular. find it here quickly. Back to the here. Our Bible here, which is Malachi 3:6. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So, that I believe. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today, yes, and forever. Here's the thing. God, the idea of God in both the Old Testament and the New Testament does not change. And this is one of those things that absolute immutability is an essential characteristic of God's nature. Now, that does raise the question, though, how does God change emotional state? Because in humans, we change all the time. We go from angry to sad. That's a change for us. God doesn't, his emotional state doesn't change regarding to any particular action because he can see all. He's omniscient. He's all-knowing. But what he does is he removes himself from that state. His essence moves away from it. So God moves himself from the situation. And that's how he manages that. So God doesn't change, and I definitely think that the biblical authors would support the idea of immutability. So, and I think it's a very plausible position, because you just see that they're already in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, they're already thinking this way. They're already thinking that God is a being that doesn't change. Because here's the consequence. If God can change, your promises aren't good. If he can change tomorrow, change his mind on his promises, we're done. We're done. We rely on the fact that God doesn't change, that he keeps his promise. He keeps his promises. So, it's one of those things where there's huge consequences to the idea that God can change. And those consequences are that none of his promises would be any good if he did change. So, immutability is an essential characteristic of a God that's omnibenevolent. That's all good. So, that's a very, very important aspect to even Christian theology, even Jewish theology. So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, the next super chat here is from N. Japonis Conrafi for $10. Thank you very much for that super chat. And he says, Talmudic narratives tell Bezalel's craftsman skills were miraculously and divinely inspired. The plain text, Exodus 35:30 to 35, seems to suggest a divinely endowed knowledge. Is this a correct interpretation? And he adds a little further context. A friend insists that Bezalel got his knowledge from God without previous experience. I said he probably acquired these skills in Egypt, but upon reading the text, he seems to have a point. All right, let's read the text. Let's read the text and then discuss the text. Okay. And the text in question here is Exodus 5:30 to 30. Okay. Then Moses said to the sons of Israel, "See, the Lord has called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And has filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, in knowledge, and in knowledge of all craftsmanship, to make designs for working in gold and silver and in bronze, and in cutting of the stones for settings, and the carving of wood, so as to perform in every inventive work. He also put in his heart to teach, both he and Oholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. He has filled them with skill to perform every work of an engraver, and of a designer, and of an embroiderer in blue and in purple, and in scarlet material and fine linen, and of a weaver, as performers of every work and makers of designs." Alrighty. Here's what we have here. Okay. Your friend is doing something called eisegesis. Now, the Talmudic sages did the same thing, so he's not alone. Because in the Talmud, frankly, the sages are not going to want to admit that Bezalel created Israel's most holy artifact using skills he picked up from those dirty Egyptians. Okay? So they're not going to want to admit that. That's not something they want to admit. But it says here in the text, we'll read the text, verse 31 is probably the first challenge. And he has filled him with the Spirit. Okay, yeah, he's filled him with the Spirit. In wisdom, in understanding. So he's not being just filled with the Spirit of God. He's being filled with wisdom and understanding and in knowledge and all craftsmanship. We're not told, however, how he filled them. And that's probably the big kicker here, is that's a detail that's left out. Even verse 35, which is, he has filled them with skill to perform every work of an engraver and of a designer. Again, we're not told how he filled it. If we talk here about, say, this is the making of the Ark of the Covenant is an act of inspiration, divine inspiration, okay? And if we go back to how we come to, say, just the biblical texts themselves, and the biblical texts, if we put them on a basis of what's more holy, the biblical texts or the Ark of the Covenant, well, the biblical texts are actually more holy, okay? Okay. But yet we know it's a synthesis of God and man. Man is the instrument that God is playing. It's not, but the instrument makes its own sound. The doctrine of inspiration is that God has prepared that person throughout their entire life, to write whatever text that God wants him to write. So that could be with, say, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. That could be with, say, his schooling, his work experience, his pedigree. All these life experiences feed into that inspiration. God has supernaturally directed the lives of these people so that they can produce inspired works. This is the same for Bezalel. He's an inspired craftsman who's been directed through his life and experiences in Egypt, in a workshop. His parents probably bought him an apprenticeship. He served many years probably in a workshop, and he learned every craft that the Egyptians would have taught. Because all of these, there's none of these crafts on this list that are, say, unique apart from the Egyptians. If you could point to some of these things and go, oh yeah, the Egyptians never did this. Well, you might have a point there. Okay, there's no way he could have gotten that because the Egyptians didn't do it. But all of these crafts are known to the Egyptians. So it's much more likely that he learned this stuff in Egypt and then was inspired to apply it to this particular project. So I think the interpretation is incorrect. I think the interpretation relies on eisegesis. You have to read something into that text that's not there in order to get that meaning out of it. So if you're not doing it from exegesis and you're doing it from eisegesis, you cannot rely on an interpretation on that basis. So that's where I think it's sort of going off the off the rails here for both, say, the Talmudic sages and for your friend. I'll say this. I almost never rely on the Talmud for history, especially ancient history. It's just so full of stuff that's not great. So, when it's talking about events more current to its time, it's a bit better. But for, say, stuff on, say, the Exodus, no, I wouldn't rely on this at all. It just doesn't produce sound interpretations. So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, the next super chat here is also from N Japonis Khan Rafi for $10. Thank you for the super chat. He said, just want to say thank you. You suggested the other day I read Calvin to get a more moderate view of Calvinism. Well, yeah. I'm already seeing what you mean. Reading the Institutes plus comments on the Gospel of John and First John. Absolutely, yeah. But we find this with a lot of writers. You'll ask, was John Calvin a 5-point Calvinist? No, he wasn't. Was Pelagius a Pelagian? No, he wasn't. There's a lot of theologies that sort of take a life of their own after the founder dies. Now, you do get some that are basically bad or even worse than their students became. But yeah, we do find this in history where some people's theology is just sort of takes on a life of its own through that process of reductionism and simplification. And Calvinism is definitely one of these. So, anyway, So anyway, I would definitely say, keep up reading Calvin. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I mean, I really liked reading Calvin. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Patui says, laughing my, yep, Calvin was the moderate. Yeah, he was the moderate. Well, you'd certainly never see him make a fatalist interpretation. I mean, you never see him do that. A lot of the new Calvinists are not much different than full-on fatalists. But Calvin wasn't. He definitely wasn't. And that more moderate reform, you can see that more moderate reform theology throughout his work. So, and, a lot of the reformers were like this. I mean, read Melanchthon. Melanchthon is very moderate. You wouldn't know that, a generation later at the Augsburg conference, confession, and they're going like full bore tilt, with a hard reading of what he said. So yeah, there's that happened, and we saw it in the Reformation. We actually see it in many periods of church history. So it's not an unusual effect. But, you can't blame Calvin for what his successors muck up, essentially. So, anyway, Thank you very much for that super chat. I'm glad you're enjoying reading. I hope you're enjoying reading Calvin. I found it enjoyable when I did. And definitely, if you get the words from the horse's mouth, you're more likely to get a more steady, moderate view of a lot of, people's theology. Okay. Next one here is from Tom Wamchek for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Thoughts on the work of John Hilber, Victor Matthews. Okay. Can't comment on Victor Matthews. I haven't read enough of his work to really say. John Hilber, on the other hand, I've actually read some of his work. When he sticks to Old Testament stuff, I like it. I don't have many problems with his Old Testament writing. He does, when he tries to dabble into the Egyptology bit, he does tend to not always get everything right. But that's a common thing. I've seen guys like, Richard Hess and Gary Rensburg. Guys I normally respect for their biblical stuff. Once they start getting into that Egyptian material, they muck it up pretty badly. So, I like them when they sort of, because one of the things about Egyptology is it's a very complicated field. Very complicated field. It's a field that's language driven. It's driven by its primary sources. It's a primary source field. And unless you're really good with the sources, you can muck this thing up. And it's complicated enough that it resists oversimplification. So I like Hilber when he talks Old Testament. I like him. Okay, I like his work. When he sort of veers off into some cognate readings of Egyptian, because he doesn't know Egyptian. He doesn't know Egyptian. He relies on translations, and that can be a very dodgy and dicey thing if you're doing, say, expository work. So anyway, and it's not like Hebrew. It's not a language like Hebrew where if you really have to be really focused on Egyptian as a language to get the most out of it. This is one of the reasons why I say Hebrew language training is, at most seminaries, it's 2 years. Greek language training, it's 3 years. Egyptian language training is 4. Okay? So if that gives you some idea of the variance of complexity between the languages, you can sort of get a grasp on why some Old Testament scholars are not so good at handling Egyptian material. I mean, I've even seen, guys like Dan McClellan goof this thing up badly. He had a short recently where he translated Ramses' Ra is born, or something like that. He left out the pronoun. He left out the additional pronoun in the name Ramses because it's Ramasu. Ra has begotten him. But again, he's another guy that feels comfortable talking about Egypt when he doesn't know any better. So there you go. So anyway, like Hilber when he sticks to the Old Testament. That's what I'll say. Victor, I don't know anything about because I haven't read enough of his material. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that helped. Addison Weir for $4.99. Who makes better videos? Linguist Ammo or What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You? Oh. I know how I should answer this. Rob Rowe. IP. Yeah, so I am not going to make them fight on this, okay? I will say I definitely think they both produce great videos. Okay? Um I definitely think they both produce good videos. Linguist Ammo has ticked me off a lot less though. Yeah, what your pastor didn't tell you keeps annoying me. So, yeah. Not good enough? Yeah, Linguist Am was less annoying. Give him that. Okay. So, on that divisive question, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much for the super chat. All right, the next one here is from Trey Mauno for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. He asks, why are Christians not observing Torah now when the commands say forever in many places? Okay. As Jesus said, he didn't come to abolish the law and not to relax the least of the commandments. Okay. He also came to fulfill the law. Okay, now, when we talk about the law, we have to be careful here not to use blanket. The word law, Torah, can mean different things in different contexts, like all Hebrew words. All Hebrew words are contextually oriented. Okay? So, a Torah can mean, say, the 5 books of Moses. It can mean the ritual law. It can mean other, legal aspects too. So, there's a lot of contextualization for the word Torah. Okay? So, now when it talks about it being, say, a Berit Olam, an everlasting covenant, okay? We also know that, say, Jeremiah 31:31 says that there's a new covenant that will supersede the old. The thing with the old covenant, with, say, the ritual law, that observance of, say, of that Torah, is a lot of it is dependent upon there being a temple. And in many ways, neither the Jews nor the Christians can observe it, because there's no temple to observe where it can be observed. Okay? There's no tabernacle. So things such as, do not slaughter your ox, your sacrificial ox in your yard. Okay? Well, no one's doing sacrificial oxes anymore. So, that's not a command that's going to apply to anyone, anywhere. So, the whole thing is, though, he didn't come to abolish the law, but he said to fulfill it. And to fulfill it was to fulfill the sacrificial system. So, that's the reason why Christians are not observing every jot and tittle of the Torah law, because a lot of that law is under the sacrificial system. Grain sacrifices, sin sacrifices, how to slaughter an animal in a way that's kosher, clean versus unclean animals. A lot of that, again, is all under that sacrificial system of the Sinai covenant. And that's been superseded. Because that Sinai covenant covers more than just the laws. It covers how God engaged sin. Under that old covenant, you were not just responsible for keeping the law. You were responsible for what your parents did. And their parents. and their parents, and their parents, going all the way back to Adam. Okay? So with all that weight of sin, all the sacrificial law did was it covered it over, but it never deleted it. Think of it this way. If you've ever used a typewriter, and I know most people haven't anymore, but if you were a typist, okay, and somebody gave you a 100,000 handwritten page manuscript and said, type this up without making any mistakes, it's too difficult. You're going to get maybe a page, maybe 2 pages in, and sooner or later your finger's going to slip and you're going to make a mistake. Well, if you're a typist, what do? You basically open the drawer of your desk, you reach in, you pull out a bottle of whiteout. And you take that whiteout, you cover over the mistake, and then you type over top of it. The mistake is still there underneath the whiteout. But the whiteout allows you to continue typing. That's the purpose of sacrificial law. The sacrificial law is whiteout. It's there to cover over the sin that's still there so that you and God could still have a relationship, but it doesn't get rid of the sin. That's Torah. Okay? So, what Jesus came and he did when he fulfilled the law is he didn't just cover it over. He's not like the sacrifices of bulls and calves, just like it says in Hebrews. He took away the sin. He basically got rid of it. All that sin was forgiven. So that sacrificial system is no longer in effect. It's obsolete. You don't need it anymore. So that's why Christians do not still practice the sacrificial, sacrificial system. Basically, the ritual law. We still believe that, say, the moral law is in effect. Like, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Those are still perfectly good laws, and you shouldn't do them. But your sins are forgiven in Christianity by the finished work of Jesus Christ. So, I hope that explains it. Thank you very much for the super chat, and I hope that helped. Paulus Patros for $2 Canadian. Thank you very much for the super chat. What are your thoughts on the veneration of icons? Well, I have a few thoughts. It's a late practice in the early church. Okay, the first icons appear in the historical record around 500 AD, so it comes in very late. It's only during, say, the life of Saint John of Damascus where the whole issue of icons and the iconoclast controversy starts heating up. Now, I understand the theology behind the veneration of icons. Okay? The idea that an image can be the eyes and the ears of the saints through a process called apotheosis. Okay? Basically, the souls of people take on these almost almost godlike qualities where they can be in more than one place at once, so you can venerate at that point. So I understand that theology. I also understand that it is not idolatry. Okay? It's not idolatry. So it's not the same as worshiping, say, God. Not the same as worshiping God at all. It's more akin to basically asking your brother and sister to pray for you. Okay? So it's more akin to that. And I understand that. I think that's fine. It's also not talking to the dead. So I understand that as well. It's because the dead in Christ aren't dead. They are alive. So just like Jesus said, I am the God of God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Okay? So the prohibition of talking to the dead here would not qualify. Okay? Now, there's a rub. There's a rub. The question then is not, so it's not forbidden. It's not forbidden, but is it beneficial? That's a different matter. Okay? Is it beneficial? Well, when we understand that the purpose of prayer is not to say change the world, but to align your mindset with God's. So it's more to change you than to change the world. Yes, sometimes God intervenes and he does change the world. But it's not primarily to change the world. It's to change you, to build your faith and your trust in God. When we see, like, for example, the Lord's Prayer, he says, the apostles say, teach me to pray. Teach me to pray. He goes, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed, holy be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Okay? So it's a call. It's a call to God the Father to change change you, that you may conduct his will on planet Earth. Now, the saints in heaven, they don't need that. They're in a perfect accord at this point with God's will. So, and praying to them doesn't exactly, I mean, it might help, maybe, but it seems pretty unlikely with how the New Testament is patterned prayer, which is go right to the Father. Go right to the Father. That doesn't prevent those who live among you and are your friends, from praying for you, because we want to share each other's burdens. It's a little more difficult for a saint to share your burdens. They're sort of beyond this mortal coil. Yeah, okay, if you can get them to pray for you, then maybe they will. I also think the whole idea of apotheosis is a bit problematic. I think there are qualities we do take on in the next life. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I'm not sure omnipresence is one of them. Considering God is not omnipresent. So, since God is not omnipresent, I kind of doubt that the saints are. So I think there's an issue with that, too. So, I think there's issues of efficacy. I think there are issues of theology. But I don't think this is it's not a sin. It's not forbidden. If you want to do it, great, fantastic. I think I have no problem with you doing it. I personally don't. Venerate saints in that way because I don't think it's efficacious. But that's my opinion. That's a personal opinion. Oh yeah, in the next life, once I kick the bucket, yeah, I'll love to have conversations with those saints. Absolutely. Well, Pablo, they are already cheering us on. I mean, they are already cheering us on, but there's limits to what they can do, and I think there, in some ways, we've ascribed them too much power. So, it's as I say, it's not a matter. This is not a matter of sin. This is not a matter of anything like that. It's just a matter of efficacy. Is it beneficial? And then in that case, why not just go directly to the Father? we encourage other people to pray, so we have a loving, supporting community. The fact is, when you pray for your brother, God is changing your attitude towards your brother so you can love your brother better. That's the point of communal prayer, is so we're doing it as a community. Yep, as and where you did hear me right. God is not omnipresent, because there's a difference between energy and essence, because God is a transcendent God. So yeah, you did hear me right. But I have gone into that before. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the veneration of icons. If you want to do it, fantastic. I see no problem with you doing that if God feels, or if you feel that God is calling you to do that as part of your devotion and your orthopraxis. I don't, but I don't think it's a sin either. I don't think it's sinful. I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's not necessarily efficacious. So that's my opinion on it. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that sort of clarified some of the issues here. Okay. Next super chat here is from Jesse Stone for $5. Thank you very much for that super chat. Found some recordings online of your exchanges at prior ETS meetings. Chronology with Petrovich and Roll and the Nephilim Neanderthal talk. Good grief. Oh, that Neanderthal talk was special. Oh, that was special. The guy hadn't read the 100 years of scholarly literature on Genesis 6. That was really... That was... Yeah, yeah, if you haven't seen that recording, that was just wow. That was one of the strangest theories I've ever seen. I mean, his whole, for those who don't know, basically, Douglas Petrovich had presented this paper at ETS, and he basically said that the sons of God were fallen angels. Okay, now there are people who do hold that. You know, Heiser holds something like that, and that the sons of God and women, got together and had little baby Nephilim. Okay, but Petrovich's twist on this was the Nephilim were the Neanderthals and had Nephilim DNA and had angel DNA. Ooh, ooh, ouch. I mean, this does present some real odd theological problems. So, it's a really, it's a whack theory. And this is one of the most debated passages in the Old Testament. There's like almost an article a year published on this for the past century and a half. There's over 100 articles out there on this topic, and it's still being actively debated. But boy, I think of all the potential theories, this is one of the worst, one of the most laughable. Okay, so anyway, well, I hope you enjoyed those recordings. Yeah, there was some interesting stuff on those recordings. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and thank you for the comment. Got that comment up yet? Oh yeah, here he is. Okay, he adds, Jesse Stone adds, He was even asked directly about two fairly recent perspectives, Heiser and Klein, and he had no clue what either said. Yeah. He hadn't read the literature. He hadn't read the literature. You know, he hadn't read Michael Heiser and he hadn't read Meredith Klein. You know, and it's not like that literature's not available. You know, it's some of the easier literature to get. So, no, I mean, look, Doug's not a reader. Okay, he doesn't read much. One of the reasons why he didn't do all that well at his PhD program. He passed, and some have debated should he have passed. I'll leave that as an open debate for people. But I wouldn't have passed his dissertation. But the reason why he had to do comprehensive exams when he was at the University of Toronto was because he didn't study that hard. He's not a studier. He doesn't read much. He doesn't study. He doesn't go back and research scholarship. He more or less just sort of wings it. And he's been doing this for a long time. He spends most of his time going church to church fundraising. That's what he does most of the time. He's very good at that. Oh, he's a phenomenal fundraiser. Yeah. I mean, he basically started off as a missionary. So he's got that missionary mindset where you go to churches, you tell churches what you're doing, and you raise funds. And then you go to the next church. This is how, Petrovich was able to get $33,000 to publish his book. Now, that $33,000 wasn't used to write the book. That $33,000 was used with $2,000 more from his mother-in-law. Yeah, he took a loan from his mother-in-law for $2,000. He paid $35,000 to have Carta publish his book. Basically, give him a big old bag of money and say, "Hey, publish my book." Because Carta didn't want to publish it. I mean, they gave him an astronomical price that they thought nobody would be able to raise. Yeah, they underestimated that man. I never underestimate the resourcefulness of that guy. He is one of the most resourceful men I've ever met. Incredibly resourceful. He can go to a church with a hat in his hand and just come out with it full of money. He's that kind of guy. But when it comes to his scholarship, his academic writing, it's just whacked. It's just whacked. And a lot of it is just because he doesn't read. So, yeah, so anyway, so it doesn't surprise me. And I was actually there at that. I was actually sitting in the back of his paper, the one he gave at ETS on the Neanderthals. And I basically told him that everything he had done, in fact, you probably hear me rant if you've got the recording, hear me rant about how he hadn't read any of the literature. That these are views that have been debunked for 50, 60 years. So, oh yeah. Linguist Ammo says, I tried reading his book on Hebrew being the oldest language, and it was just abysmal. Yeah, I've got it beside me on the bookshelf here. It is abysmal. It's one of the worst. I think it's the worst book I've ever read on early alphabetic inscriptions. It's bad. It's really bad. His second book's no better. His second book is no better. Yeah. Slam RN says, but Petrovich was able to translate for the first time 16 ancient inscriptions that said collecting dust in museum stairs for over 100 years. Yeah, but he didn't. He didn't really. Here's the thing. He used his Hebrew is so idiosyncratic. It's not Hebrew. It's not Hebrew. It's something else. If he's correct, and he's not correct, he makes so many mistakes on those translations. He includes in some of them Mater's Lectionis, which didn't even exist in Hebrew for another 600 years, according to his date of the Exodus. There's his translation of the Little Egyptian he did was terrible. The circular reasoning, I couldn't believe the circular reasoning. I mean, it just was crazy. Oh yeah. He translated him into speech patterns that nobody ever uses, and a lot of his work was just sort of because they're so idiosyncratic, these translations, that that doesn't even make sense culturally. It doesn't make sense. Like, he had translated one of them as a swooping came down. That was weird. That was just plain weird. Or like when he talks about the one that talks about Ahisamic, how the walls were engraved, they were carved. Well, Egyptian walls of homes weren't engraved, they were painted. So well, thank you. You just needling me, huh? Slam says, I believe you just needling you. Like, I need more needling. I think I'm full of holes at this point. Well, I mean, grab my copy here. Here's my copy. All right. Here's my copy. And you can see it is just full of redlining and comments. Now, just one of the weirdest things is he quotes himself 40 times. He quotes himself 40 times. That was fun. 17 of those quotes were for a book he hadn't even published. Well, it's going to wash out on the camera, so. But it's crazy. It's just crazy. Yeah, he quotes himself for a book not even published. Like, it's like, well, wait a minute. This book has not even been written. He's written it now, but he's quoting a future book that has no contract, no literary contract assigned to it, no outline, no chapters. It's just like it's amazing. I've never seen anything quite like it. I feel like doing, okay, I'm going to write a book about everything someday. And whatever I say, I'm just going to write Folk publication forthcoming. Book of everything. Well, okay. I'll add this. I'll take this as probably the last comment on this one and get back to the super chats here. But Jesse Stone adds, I haven't actually heard him respond to criticism of his book either. Well, he's taken on essentially a kind of posturing when it came to his book. He used to say that nobody that read his book has, no one who's reviewed his book has actually read it. Yeah, well, my review, I read the book because I bought it. The reason why very few people actually reviewed his book was because he didn't give out. He instructed the publisher not to send out review copies. Very easy to have a book that's not reviewed if you don't send out review copies, because no one wants to pay for these books. But I was so curious and heard so much about this book that I bought this copy myself. And then I wrote a review for the review of biblical literature, and I did state in that book review that, yeah, I read it. I own a copy. But he still says that nobody who's reviewed it has read it. So and he's never responded. The only time he's ever responded to my book review is he says, "Oh, I don't engage junior academics."
And you got your PhD.
I got my PhD years before he did, and I'm the junior academic. Okay. I'm not sure how that works. I could probably post it here. Let's see here. I can post the book review. Let's see. Just give me a moment here to go to academia. And I will post a link to my book review. Let's see here. Where's there it is. Here. Okay, I'll put it into the live chat here. There we go. Enjoy. All right. So, with that said, I think we're going to move on here with the super chats. Thank you very much for that question, and that rabbit trail was quite entertaining. Oh, and Japon's coming around. The people who reviewed his book on Amazon had no idea what they were reading. Yeah, it's just yeah, he says Petrovich's book having 4.7 stars on Amazon. Well, yeah, I mean, if you read it, it's more like listening to Petrovich's talking points, not that they understood any of the content. Whoa. So, anyway, that's all we're going to say on Petrovich's book here, and we'll get back to the super chat. So, thank you very much. All righty, here are our note here. And the Bible Exegete asks, what? Hey, Junior. The Bible Exegete for 10 Romanian. Thank you very much for the super chat. Can Shasu and Apiru be considered synonyms? No. No, they're not synonyms. Shasu are the wandering tribes that basically they wandered the area of Edom, Midian, and the Sinai. Okay, that's their home territory. Okay. Apiru, and to be very honest, Shasu are an ethnicity. It's an ethnonym. It's a name that's used for an ethnicity. The Apiru is a social class. It means bum. It means it can mean mercenary. It can mean outcast. It can mean bum. Sojourner can be an Apiru. They're basically your societal outcasts, people who are living on the outskirts or outside of cities, where good people didn't go. Okay, so it's a social class. It's a social class. It's definitely a social class, and we see that in the Mari letters, that it's like Tero of Urkesh says in one of his letters to the king of Mari, now that he's been forced to abandon Urkesh, now I have become an Apiru. Okay. He wasn't an Apiru before, but now he'd become one. So it's definitely talking about a social class. Whereas in the case of the Shasu are an ethnicity, and an easily identifiable ethnicity. The other thing about Apiru too is we find them being referenced all the way from Babylon, up through the Fertile Crescent, and then back down all the way to Egypt. So they're everywhere. They also have a lot longer run because the Shasu, we start seeing them during the reign of Tutmosis II, and they sort of taper off around the 9th century, where they're sort of, they become the Edomites. Yeah, they eventually become the Edomites. The earliest references to the Apiru, I believe, are in the 1800s BC. Okay, so they're around a long, long time. But this is to be expected with social classes anyway. You know, social classes do tend to even to last longer in cultural milieus, because social classes don't change half as much as, say, ethnicities, which can be conquered by battles and wars, you know, wiped out by plagues, you know, declining birth rates. You know, things can happen to ethnicities that don't necessarily happen to social classes, because social classes tend to be so distributed. So, in short, they're not the same. They're not synonyms at all. Shasu only appear in the southern Levant. Appear are all over the place. And they function differently in context. So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, super chat here is from Tui Tsumatos. He asks, did ancient Egypt have smoke fumigation rituals for healing and cleanliness? Yes, they did. This is what's called... It's an interesting question. Yes, a very interesting question. It's called thurification. It's basically taking incense or a fragrant wood and burning it so that it creates a smoke, usually a pleasant or smelling smoke. And they did this frequently. They did this for cleansing. Like, for example, if, let's say, they didn't wash their hands, they would run their hands through smoke. That was considered to be a proper method of cleanliness in ancient Egypt. If they wanted to clean a shrine prior to the installation of a god, they would wave the incense in there, and usually with an incense spoon. So this is, as I say, this is called thurification, and they definitely had this. A lot of them. Like, for example, we have even reliefs of Queen Hatshepsut. Her throne is being waved with a incense spoon before she sits in it. So yeah, it's very common. It's very common in Egypt, and they would do this with incense of various kinds, like myrrh, frankincense. They would even do this with stuff like sandalwood. So it was very, very common. We see it all over the place in reliefs. It talks about this in the texts. So absolutely. We even have actually one interesting text from Elephantine, an Aramaic text that talks about the Israelites when they're in Elephantine, and they're doing a thurification ritual to the goddess Balat, the Queen of Heaven. Queen of Heaven. And yeah, what are good Israelites doing with that? Yeah, that's seems like as soon as the Israelites go back to Egypt, you know, it's back to the same stuff. Yeah. So there's a lot of evidence for this, a lot of it. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and I hope that helped. Next is... let's see what's next here. Here is from... Jesse Stone for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Favorite research library you have visited? Oh. Oh. Oh, wow. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Well, okay, my favorite one is still going to be the University of Liverpool's. Just because even though that had the best resources I ever actually used. So I like that. I mean, I know the University of Chicago Library has great resources, but kind of hard to find things in there, in all honesty. Was it the Hunt? Yeah, what was that one called again? Yeah, there's a one in it's not the Huntington. That's a research library, but that's on the West Coast. Although the Huntington has the best artwork. Huntington has amazing artwork. What's it called now? Oh, there's another research library downtown Chicago that was really, really interesting too. It's outside of my favor, outside of really my field. But if you're into sort of medieval or Reformation studies, it's excellent. But for my particular work, my favorite was still the University of Liverpool's, just because it had the best collection with the easiest to access. And if you're doing a lot of reading and a lot of research, you want to save time. You don't want to spend going through these snaky quarters to different weird portions of the library where they stuffed books. Newberry. Yeah, the Newberry. Nice library. Nice library. Very nice library. Not efficient way to get books, though. Not efficient at all. But that one's a beautiful library, too. Yeah, I'd stay away from Hyde Park. Yeah, that's a pretty you're taking your life in your hands if you're going to go to Hyde Park. Yeah, a lot of muggings there. A lot of muggings. So that's my favorites. At least the ones that I've visited. But I've visited a lot of libraries too, so but anything that can get me my resources fast, and has a wide variety of resources, is usually something I'm all game for. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, very much appreciated, and there's my opinion. Okay, the next one here is from Shirao for 2.0 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think John, son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John, or do you think it was someone else? Also, thanks for the work you have put on your channel. Okay. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm just going to lay this one right here. I'm not exactly sure who wrote the book of John. We do know it's identified as John, but John was a common name too. There's good arguments on both sides of this. So John of Zebedee could have been. It also could have possibly been John the Elder. That's also possible as well. But I don't have a hard opinion on this. I haven't looked at the issue either enough to really come down on a decision. So we do know it's recognized from the earliest church fathers, so it's not a forgery. It's a well accepted, well known. At least we know that this would have been the author. The author is John. We're just not sure which one, because John is such a common name. So again, could have been either. Could have been either. So in short, I don't have an opinion on this. I don't have an opinion on it. But either is a possible option. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And we got another question here from Jesse Stone. And he asks, how did the Egyptians practice prayer? Ooh, interesting question. Did Egyptians have anything like mystical or ecstatic prayer? Any similarities between Egyptian and Israelite prayer? Oh, yes. Okay, great set of questions there. The Egyptians did practice prayer. Okay? They would often practice it outside of temples. Okay? Your average Egyptian could not get into a temple. They're not allowed in temples. Only priests and, say, scribes would be allowed in temples. So your average Egyptian doesn't get entry into a temple. You have to be part of the pot people to get in. That's the nice people, by the way. That's the nice, clean, nice smelling people. Okay. So with the practice of prayer, what people would do is on the outsides of these temples, on the outside of the walls, are ears carved into the wall. So these ears are supposed to be the ears of the gods listening to your prayers from the outside. They would also leave little ear amulets on the outsides of walls too. So again, their gods can hear them pray. So we know that the Egyptians practiced prayer. Now, we don't know if they have anything like mystical or ecstatic prayer. That much we're not sure. But there is some similarity between Egyptian and Israelite prayer. For example, there's a common practice in both types of prayer where they would lie prostrate on the ground, face down, as they pray. So they're not kneeling, they're not sitting, they're laying flat on their face, praying. So that's one similarity. They would also appeal to their God, just like the Israelites would. So there is some similarities between Egyptian and Israelite prayer. both in how it's done and sort of where it's practiced too. Because even the Israelites, they couldn't go into the Holy of Holies. They're on the outside. They can be in one of the courts if they're an Israelite. Like, for example, if they were a priest, they can go into the priestly court. If they're a man, well, but not a priest, they can only go up to the court of the men. And if they're women and children, they got that third court. And if they're Gentiles, they're on the outside looking in. Okay? So people did in Israelite prayer practice also pray on the outside. So that was also a thing that's, because remember, these are not churches, these are temples. They're sacred space, and only certain individuals can get in. So this is true of both Egyptian temple ritual practice as well as Israelite temple ritual practice. So you do see some very similar things happen in both cases. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. But yeah, it's a very interesting subject, the whole idea of Egyptian prayer, because they did do it. They did do it, and they did it as close to their God as they could. Okay, next one here is from Darkblade. And he asks, what is the history of the Exodus mythicist position? Also, who knows more Latin? Dr. Falk or Darkblade? Probably Darkblade. Latin is not a language I claim. Okay? I tried to get Latin under my belt so badly. You know, that's one of those languages that was, you know, supposed to be offered every year at TEDS and never was once during my whole time there. So, yeah, we got a petition of 45 names, and they just never would offer that class. So I never got the chance to learn Latin. I really wanted to learn Latin. In fact, one of the things was when I was sitting, when I did my interview for my PhD, you know, you basically get interviewed with 3 or 4 of the faculty, and I had an interview committee of 3 people, three professors, and they're all sitting around. They asked how about my language capabilities, and I told them what they were. And you know, Greek came up, and they started laughing. Oh, yeah, like we all got our Greek and Latin with our mother's milk, and I'm just sitting there going, don't ask me about my Latin. Yeah, I mean, everyone over in England who basically becomes a professor pretty much knows Greek and Latin because they take it in high school. But well, again, in grade school too. Yeah, they do, don't they? But not if you're from America. You got to go out of your way to get that. So, yeah. So you definitely know probably more Latin than I do. It got embarrassing though when I was in my PhD program because, you know, I'd have to sometimes talk to the staff, like the administration, and the administration would send me this reply in Latin, this terse reply in Latin. It's like, I don't know any Latin, so yeah, that was awkward sometimes. That was definitely awkward. Francis Dodds asks, let me just mark my place here. Francis Dobbs asks the question, do Canadians learn other languages besides French, I'm guessing, more compared to Americans? We get French in school. Everyone gets French in school. Okay. How much French is depends on the student and what they will end up doing in life. But you are required in Canadian schools to do up to grade 11 of an approved language. And that approved language is either French, German, or Spanish. Okay? Now, here's the rub. Most schools do not offer German and Spanish. So you're almost forced to take French. Okay? Yeah, so very few high schools offer German or Spanish. And you are required to take, I think, minimum grade 8 French. You can transfer to another language later, but everyone's got to take grade 8 French. And you start getting French in grade 5. So, Canadians are pretty much force-fed at French. And it's not a French you can use anywhere in the world, really. I mean, it's Quebecois French, so it's a very sort of regional dialect. So it's not something you can really use in Paris. So, yeah, I tried to use my French once in Paris and was told, nah, don't do that. Don't do that. We all speak English. Don't. Stop. Stop. Please. Stop. Yeah. So that's pretty typical of a Canadian school system, is you can have any language that you want as long as it's French. Conversely, in Quebec, they don't teach English in high schools. So, but that's an attempt to protect their French culture and French identity. Now, on the other hand, most Quebecois do speak English, just because they need it for business purposes. So, thank you very much for that question. Ancient History Gamer says, I have problems with my own native language, English, laugh out loud. Yeah, you're not alone. Everybody has problems with English, is because English is a crazy language. It's a nutso language. You check your cash and cash your check. It's like English does some strange things. Adjective order, very, very bizarre. It's a very bizarre thing. A native English speaker intuitively knows where the correct adjective goes. Most foreign speakers don't. It's a very difficult rule. Very difficult rule. Spelling, don't get me started with that I before E except after C and Z. It's just like nonsense rules. I mean, rules that have so many exceptions as to not even be coherent. And then don't get me started with the 50 uses of the comma. I mean, comma has so many rules attached to it. You have to be like an attorney, like a lawyer, to figure out how to use the freaking comma. 50 different uses. It's an absolutely insane language. That's why native English speakers are not terribly proficient at English. I submitted an article once to a peer-reviewed journal. And I had one of my peer reviewers was David Warburton. Of course, he didn't like me anyway. So that didn't help. But one of the things he said was, he said, "Who's this guy? He's just is he a foreign language, second language, or English as a second language student? Because his English is terrible." Yeah, my English is terrible. That's because I'm a native English speaker. That's the definition of being. Here's this German. Okay, here's this German who is legitimately an English as a second language learner critiquing my native Canadian English. Like, yes, my English is terrible because I'm an English. I'm a native speaker. Most English speakers are like this, though, in the Americas. But in all honesty, too, a lot of the reason why our English is so terrible as well is because we don't do say Latin. I mean, one of the reasons why British English used to be good. It's no longer good. No longer good. Used to be good because they used to force students to take Latin as well. And Latin forces you to learn the parts of language. Forces you into learning grammar and syntax and all these things, cases, stuff that makes language work. If you, one of the things I discovered when I was grading papers in England was the grammar of British students, university students, is just, it's no longer good. It's just as bad as you find in America now. Just as bad. So, anyway, thank you very much for the question. Back to 8:55 here. Okay. And the second part of the Dark Blade question here was, what is the history of the Exodus mythicist position? It came in with minimalism, really. Now, there'd always been people who had doubted the whole Exodus, how do I say this, a position, but it really starts kind of with the documentary hypothesis and basically critical scholarship of the 19th century. So you got guys like Wellhausen, who basically ascribes the Pentateuch to a late date. But then you also had guys like von Rad. And what von Rad would say was that, well, the events in Exodus, if they were true at all, and he always couched it that way, if they were true at all, they're a myth designed to aggrandize the Israelites while they were in Babylon. Okay? So it's that critical scholarship that really sorts of introduces this skepticism towards the Exodus. Now, the mythicist stuff gets its sort of borrowing. It's in one sense, it's borrowing. It's borrowing from several things. It's borrowing from minimalism, because the idea was, well, King David's a myth, and if King David's a myth, Moses is definitely a myth. So you had guys like Tommy Thompson and Lemke, this rogues gallery of biblical minimalists who basically declared, Exodus to be a mythicist kind of work. Now, you still have a lot of people today that hold that position, especially those that lean more towards the minimalist spectrum. But it's sort of got it's got its shoes on with critical scholarship of the late 19th century, but it really sort of didn't sort of integrate the mythicist element until the 1970s and 80s. So that's where you start seeing it come to the forefront here. So in its modern form, it's kind of a recent position, but it does have its roots going way back. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. We really appreciate it. Okay, Jonathan for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Heard someone recently use John 3:12 to argue in favor of a literalist reading of the creation account. Do you have any thoughts on that? I think the literalist account is a really bad reading, but let's take a look at the passage. John John 3. Okay. Jesus said, I'm going to start verse 10 here just to get a little context. Jesus answered, and he's talking here to Nicodemus. This is the famous, the famous conversation in the middle of the night with Nicodemus. Jesus answered and said to him, are you the teacher of Israel and do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say unto you, We speak that which we know and bear witness of that which we have seen, and you do not receive our witness? If I told you earthly things and you do not believe, how shall you believe if I tell you heavenly things? And no one has ascended into heaven, but he who has descended from heaven, even the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted. All right, I'm going to stop at verse 14 here. Okay? Okay. I think one of the issues that, to use this verse 12 as a proof text for a literalist reading, I think takes the whole thing out of context. Jesus here is not talking about creation. He's not talking about that at all. He's talking about how Israel sort of interacted with basically God. How did he, Moses lifts up the serpent so that as a parabolic act, as a typology, as a type. So the Son of Man has to be the antitype of what Moses did. So what he's doing here is he's presenting Nicodemus with the various types of which are kind of embodied prophecy. It's basically an act. It's a prophetic act. So these types, these prophetic acts, have happened throughout the history of Israel. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's stepping Moses through these parabolic acts, the blood and the water, which is one of the cleansing rituals. It's one of the cleansing rituals of the temple. So what's happening here is it's not talking about a literalistic reading of creation at all. There's nothing here that would support that. It all has to do with parabolic acts and prophetic typology. Basically a type. Moses here lifting up the serpent. The serpent is a type of Christ. And the Son of Man is the antitype. He's the fulfillment of that prophetic act. So that's really what's going on in this text. So I think to use it in the way that is, I agree with Linguist Ammo here. Using John 3:12 to defend a young Earth creationist position is rather crazy. So I don't think it's sustainable. I really don't. So anyway, that's what's going on in the passage. And I think one of the things I think we have to do, whenever we come to a text, we have to read it in its context, its literary context, its grammatical context, its cultural context. We have to take into account all these various contexts. And the context in this passage that Christ is using is these parabolic prophetic acts, which were basically referenced throughout the New Testament. It's very clear that they're aware of this. The teachers of Israel should know this. This is basic stuff for a teacher in Israel. At least in the first century. So, Jesus asks a really good question there. And he asks, hey, you're a teacher in Israel and you don't know about types and antitypes? You don't know about that? How can that be? The Old Testament is full of them. Full of them. So that's got to be a kind of a wake-up call to Nicodemus. But that's what this is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a wake-up call. Hey, you should know this already. If you're a teacher in Israel. No. And he just says, not just a teacher, the teacher. So, yeah, I don't think this can be justified to support a young Earth creationism. And it doesn't relate at all. Doesn't relate at all. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that helped. Yay. Here from Louis Sandoval for 250. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, do you know where is the Garden of Eden located? Also, do you know where the land of Nod, where Cain dwelt, and the city he built after his son? Okay. Okay. We are not sure where Eden is located. We've got some idea that it was surrounded by 4 rivers. The river Euphrates, the river Tigris, the Pishon, and the Gihon. Okay. So one of those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates are the only 2 of those rivers that are still around. The third river, there's a third river that has been located by satellite, and one is said to be in the land of Kish, not Cush, Kish, which makes sense because that's in Mesopotamia. So, my thoughts, and this is my supposition, this is speculation. I think it's in the tidal. How do I say this? The sea has encroached inland in the Mesopotamian river valley. Okay, so the coast has actually moved inland. So a lot of places where people used to live have now become covered in water. My thought is that the Garden of Eden is probably underneath that water. Okay? So, essentially where it pours out into the ocean is where I think it might have been. Okay? So, that's my thought on where Eden is, but that's speculation. And I'm going to preface it as that. I don't know exactly where the land of Nod is. It's supposed to be east of Eden. So, that could be in the land of Elam or along that area there. And we, again, don't have any of the remains of that city. So we're not exactly sure here of a lot of these locations for where they are exactly. So, again, I think the land of Nod would end up being someplace near Elam. Garden Eden is under the water, at the mouth of that, where the Tigris and the Euphrates pour out in the ocean. That's an interesting question, too. All right, I'll take that. Okay. Francis Dodd asks, is the angel from Genesis still standing there? No. Okay. Hey, that's an easy one. That's a no. The reason why the angel's not still standing there is because it's no longer sacred space. There's no need for it to be there. Though the whole reason the angel was posted there was to guard the tree. Guard the tree of the knowledge of the tree of life. So that sinful man couldn't get back in the garden and eat of the tree and live forever. That's the danger. So, yeah. So, there's, the tree doesn't live anymore because the tree was destroyed in the flood. With the garden, essentially. The flood was the big reset button. And so, Eden was wiped out, and so was the tree. The tree no longer exists. So without that tree there's no need for the angel to be there. Neither with the flaming sword. So it's one of those things where the angel is only necessary to be there as long as you have the tree of life. If the tree of life's gone, no need for the angel to be there. Because it's not operating. It still say it would be sacred space only as long as it existed as a garden. Once that's gone, then you had some different issues. This is why when sort of you have the Sinai covenant, God is making that sacred space on top of Mount Sinai to reestablish his contact with mankind. That contact gets lost with the flood. There's some sort of weird worship going on, say, between the fall and, say, the flood. But once that flood takes place, there's no need for Eden anymore. The Eden's wiped out, the tree's wiped out, and there's no need for the angel to still be there. God has to establish a new set of sacred space, this time on Mount Sinai, to establish his covenant with his people. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. It's an interesting follow-up question, and I hope that helped. Let's see here. Okay, so here is from Algot Robertson for 50 Swedish kroners. Thank you very much for the super chat. What sect did Jesus come from, and is it safe to assume that they had the right interpretation? Also, do you drink coffee? If so, black or with milk? Well, I do drink coffee. I love my coffee. And I drink it black. Black and Rotar. Strong coffee. Very, very strong coffee. So, yes, I drink it black. And I do like it. Okay. What sect did Jesus come from? Jesus came from no real sect. So he's not a Pharisee, not a Sadducee, he's not a Herodian, he's not an Essene. He came back. He's part of a family that settled in Nazareth. Now, Nazareth is not, compared to other Israelite cities, is not an old city. It's a small town. It's a hamlet that was established when members from the tribe of Judah came back from Babylon. And they established their little enclave back in Israel. So Nazareth is kind of a backward town. It's a religious town. Okay, so it was a town that was motivated. Its formation was sort of motivated to sort of get away from sects, from the various sects of Israelite culture. So they had a synagogue. They were very devout. We do know that about the people of Nazareth. They were exceptionally devout. A lot of it was because they were very Torah adherent. They did not mingle. They didn't typically mingle with, say, Pharisees or Sadducees. So, they're sort of an enclave of their own. They're an enclave of their own. So, did they have the right interpretation? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. They also tried to kill Christ too, for claiming that he was the fulfillment of the Isaiah passage. So that's sort of where he comes from. That's his sort of his religious background as far as where he comes from within the ranks of, say, Israelite society. He comes back with the Judahites, who were exiled during the Babylonian exile, or his ancestors were. They set up Nazareth in the Judean foothills. They have a sort of secluded, isolated hamlet with a synagogue. They participated in, say, the reading of the scrolls. Very, very, very sort of religiously... we call these religiously conservative Israelites. They're religiously conservative Israelites. So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, next one from Albert Robertson for 50 Swedish kroners. Thank you for the super chat. Why do Jews interpret the Bible different? Also, why do the cultural context seems to skiffer? What's skiffer? I don't. You mean differ? I think you mean differs. Also, does archaeology support the Bible or Quran at the... Okay, that's cut off. I don't see any completeness to that question. Okay, but I can tell you why the Jews interpret the Bible differently. It comes down to a historical matter, which is early in the 1st century. There was two competing exegetical views of Genesis 3:15. Now let's bring up Genesis 3:15. Explain this. Genesis 3:15. Our Bible here. And the text says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." All right. Now, the whole question here is, who is the seed of the woman? That's the $1,000,000 question. Christians, through oral tradition, basically interpret the seed of the woman as the Messiah, Jesus Christ. In the 1st century BC, you had two competing interpretations of this passage. One interpretation said that the seed of the woman was the nation of Israel. The other competing view was that the seed was the Messiah. Now, of course, other religions do also take this passage and interpret it other ways and get other basically doctrinal results out of this. Like the Gnostics interpret this yet another way, which is that, like, for example, the Sethites will interpret the seed of the woman as Seth, the bearer of Gnostic salvific knowledge. Okay. So, and then once you get those interpretations, it goes really wild. Things start going off the rails fast. But there is what we call exegetical pressure on this verse. Exegetical pressure means that how you interpret this is going to color how you interpret other things. So, what happened in the 1st century was you had those first two exegetical readings of this passage. And what happened is when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, basically those who held the Messianic interpretation became Christians, and those Israelites who held to the nation of Israel interpretation became rabbinic Jews. And this is the beginning of that split. That schism is the beginning of the rabbinic Judaism movement, as well as the beginning of the Christian movement in earnest. Until that point, they were kind of coexisting together, not happily, mind you, but they were coexisting. So, so there's going to be there's that historical schism that happens in around 70 AD. So, but then again, too, that's also what we saw. That's how we see it play out in the history of, say, the last days of Jerusalem as well, at least before the destruction of the temple. So, that's why there's also a cultural difference as well, because both sides are going to have to accommodate how that the temple is destroyed. Like some sects, like the Sadducees, they're going to go completely extinct. They're going to go completely extinct after the destruction of the temple because they're basically a temple cult. They're temple cult. No temple, no cult. The Pharisaic movement is actually going to thrive and survive. They're going to survive and thrive after the destruction of the temple, because they're going to come to terms with the fact there's no more temple, and they're going to start interpreting things in different ways, such as, you don't no longer need a sacrifice to get your prayers covered. You can appeal directly to God through prayer. Well, that's not a Torah. That's not a Torah teaching. That's not an Old Testament teaching. That's a rabbinical teaching. That comes after the destruction of the temple. Okay, so the change in the context is going to make differences in how they reconcile the texts to their current situations. And again, we got in Christianity, you got that whole fulfillment portion of Jesus Christ where he's basically covering all that temple ritual. So the Christians just go, well, we don't need it anymore. We already have Christ. He took care of all the sins, and all the rest, if the temple ever comes back, we can do our Thanksgiving offerings, but we can just give thanks too, because we have a relationship one-to-one with God. Rabbinical Judaism is going to take a little more time to try to work those issues out. And they're going to come up with different solutions as a result. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that helped. And again, I didn't get the complete of that last question, so I can't really answer it. All right, sponsoring Jack Ray for $5, sponsoring a bonbon question. Okay. Let's see. What do we have here from Bonbon? 9:30. Let's see what we have. Okay, we'll take this one. This is a good question from Bonbon. How do we distinguish between divine punishment versus just a regular unfortunate accident? What is the differences? Okay. It can be very hard to distinguish. And we have to be also very cautious about this too. Because a lot of unfortunate accidents can be misinterpreted as divine punishment. We don't know. And this is one of the problems with say trying to make sense of why bad things happen. Okay. It can be virtually indistinguishable. Honestly, you don't know why bad things are happening to them. Is divine punishment possible? Yes, it's possible. It could be that you've stepped outside of God's protection, and a bad thing just happened to you because God's not shielding you. Okay? And this can happen, like, for example, a guy who cheats on his wife. He's stepped out of God's protection, and, she can take him to court and, take his home, take his kids, sue him for alimony, and, he cheated. He cheated. He stepped outside of God's protection. Now, is that divine punishment? Could be. But it could also be just that God doesn't protect us from our bad behavior. That's also part. There is a difference between consequences and punishment. All punishment has consequences, but not all consequences are a punishment. So that's true. So, there is a difference in law between, say, a punishment versus just what's a consequence. So, like, for example, we had a question, I think, last week about the death of David and Bathsheba's child. Is that divine punishment, or did God remove his protective hand and just let the child die? I mean, as I said in that last time, is the amount of infant mortality in the ancient world was so high. I mean, it's so high. If you live past year 6, your chances of living a full life were high. Your chances of living to age 6 were not great. So, so it's just, again, there are differences here, but we don't have the divine knowledge to be able to discern them necessarily. So, that's sort of the difference, is what is culpability, what is just bad luck too. I mean, there's that happens. There's even some cases where there's an unfortunate accident that's meant to move you in another direction, or meant to make you stronger, meant to give you persistence. And you can't know. You can't know in the moment. This is one of the things why we have to sort of, like, take for example the book of Job. It's the worst book to ever give somebody who's suffering. It was never meant to be given to people who are suffering. I mean, people who tell suffering people to read the book of Job need their head examined. Job is for the rich man. The book of Job is for the rich man. It's to tell the rich man, hey, it could all go away. All your wealth, all your success, all your fortune, all your family, it can go like that. It can disappear on you. So think about your relationship with God before that happens. That's the purpose of the book of Job. Job deserved none of that. The book of Job is quite clear that Job was upright in all his ways. He even did sacrifice on behalf of his children, just in case they might have transgressed. Job was a righteous man who was being tested for our benefit. Not for his benefit, but for our benefit. Okay? So, it's the whole thing. Rich man, consider. Rich man, look at what's going to happen to you. It can all go away in a moment. My producer said, is your relationship with God conditional on him blessing you? Because if it is, there's a weakness in that relationship. Yeah. As my producer also points out, a lot of people have deconverted because they didn't get the blessing and they didn't get what they expected, because their faith and trust in the Lord was conditional, and those conditions weren't met. So that's what I would say in regards to this question. We can never know for sure if it's punishment or an accident or consequences. And frankly, too, when we look at, say, for example, the Old Covenant, going back to that Jeremiah 31 passage, where it talks about the fathers eating grapes and the children's teeth being put on edge. This is the idea that the fathers are sinning, but the children are paying the consequences. This happens, and it still happens today. Like, for example, you get a guy it turns out to be a mass murderer. What happens to his family when he's caught? Okay, there's consequences. The father goes to jail. He's murdered somebody. He can't earn an income because he's in jail. The children now have to deal with the fact that they no longer have an income. The children have to deal with the stigma that their father was convicted of being a murderer. The children are having to deal with maybe having to pick up and leave town and go underground to prevent people from, say, death threats. Yeah. And the children are completely innocent in this, but they're reaping the consequences of the father's actions. That's not divine punishment. That's unfortunate consequences. Children are innocent, but they're reaping the consequences of their father's action. And we have to be careful that, actions do have consequences, and not necessarily for the person doing the crime. That's one of the things we have to be very careful of when we talk about, say, the whole crime and punishment, the whole divine punishment thing, is that those consequences do not always, in fact, they very rarely just affect the guy who's committing the atrocious acts. There's really no such thing as private sin. There's no such thing as private sin. It has consequences that ripple to everyone around us. That's the nature of sin. The father eats the grapes. Everyone else around him gets the consequences. So, anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you for the question, and thank you for Jack Ray for sponsoring that question. Okay. So, the next one here is from Transatlantic Whirlwind for $4.99. Thank you for the super chat. If you could hang out with one of these, who would it be? John Wesley, Calvin, or Spurgeon? Ooh, interesting choice. Interesting choice. It would have to be Spurgeon. John Wesley, I don't know. Guy doesn't drink. He was also very much into hymnody, and I'm not so much into hymnody. That's basically writing of hymns. Okay. Calvin would be interesting. Theological conversations with Calvin, that would be very, very interesting. But Spurgeon was very interesting as a person. His sermons are very insightful. It's so insightful that preachers still plagiarize him today. I heard this story once. This one is attributed to one of my professors who had to deal with a plagiarism from a pastor. Now, this one's very interesting. And this 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 young pastor plagiarized a sermon, okay, and he's taken in front of the board to answer first questions, and they present him with this book that's published by this big name scholar, and they contacted this big name scholar, and they said, hey, someone in our congregation alerted us to that this pastor of ours might have plagiarized this sermon from your book. And the big name scholar goes, yeah, that is my sermon. Yeah, he did plagiarize it. And then, okay, so they go back to him and they bring him in front of the board and they say, yeah, we contacted that scholar, and he says, yeah, you absolutely plagiarized this from his sermons. And the young pastor's having a nervous breakdown. He goes, oh, I didn't plagiarize this from the scholar. I plagiarized this from Spurgeon.
He said, yeah.
Yeah, so he admitted to plagiarizing it, but not from the scholar. So they go back to the scholar and go, hey, you plagiarized this too from Spurgeon. and the guy has a has a fit. It says the scholar goes, well, I guess I've read Spurgeon so much that I just sort of adopted his ideas without giving him credit. Yeah, you plagiarized him, and then you were ready to crucify that young pastor. Yeah. So, yeah. I'm gonna take that content. Andrew Graham says, talk about getting caught with your pants down, laugh out loud. Yeah, he got hauled up by his own petard. That's for sure. Yeah. So, I like, honestly, I like Spurgeon's work. I used to listen. There's actually a few rare recordings. Jack Ray, defend by saying I don't read much. Yeah, so it's one of those cases where I think that Spurgeon is. I heard some rare recordings. There was a radio station in Nevada, a Christian radio station, and you get some weird stuff in radio stations in Nevada. But one of the things was that like 2 a.m. in the morning, this particular radio station would play rare recordings of sermons from past great preachers. And they had a couple of rare audio recordings from Spurgeon. And man, now I can understand why he packed out his church. The guy was an amazing preacher. He was not just good in the content, but he was so expressive as he delivered it. Very, very interesting how he preached. Not just what he preached, but how he preached it. So yeah. So anyway, I think that of all those choices, I think Spurgeon would be the most interesting one. He was also, I think, a whiskey drinker too, so he'd be fun to hang around. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and led to a very interesting little rabbit trail there. Okay, the next one here. I think we're getting close to the end of the serious super chats. Okay, so we are going to. We have Addison Weir for $1.99. Thank you for that super chat. I think. Shaloop-de-doo. Okay. Not quite sure what to say about that. Nor his next one here from Addison Weir for $1.99. La 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 la. Okay. Could be.
Easy.
Alrighty, let's see. Okay, this is our last super chat here, and then we're going to go on to some non-super chats. And this is from Transatlantic Whirlwind for 199. Thank you for the super chat. Thoughts on Rashi Walton view on Genesis 3:15? Don't know exactly what Walton's view on this is. I usually end up agreeing with Walton though. My only I'd have to read him to know exactly what he said on this. Yeah, as I said, I'll take Bible Exege's comment in a moment, but yeah, I don't know exactly what his view is, but I usually end up agreeing with him on most of those, most of the Genesis stuff. As I said, my only disagreement with Walton so far on Genesis 1 to 3 is who is the Nakash, the serpent. So, but has to do with the etiology of snakes and people. Oh, I would probably, I mean, there is a symbolism there to the snake. That kind of goes without saying. But it's more than just a snake. So, I would agree with it to some extent. I definitely, if it's about etiology of snakes and people, yeah, to some extent I would agree with that, but not completely. The snake is a symbol; it's not the creature behind it. So that I would sort of I'd make the careful distinction there. So it's like the Nakash is acting like that etiology of how snakes interact with people. So, anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. The Bible Exegete online says there isn't a recording of Spurgeon. Would love to hear his voice if there are recordings. Yeah, here's the thing with that stuff, though. Very, very difficult to. Like I said, this was a guy who had an access to rare recordings. Okay, so some rare stuff is just plain rare. And some of this stuff is, they did do recordings in the 19th century, so, there's some interesting stuff out there that's in rare archives. But doing this archival stuff is really, really difficult, especially when you start getting into the archives of recordings. Anyone who knows sort of the saga of the lost episodes of Doctor Who knows how tricky archival research of recordings can be. It can be exceptionally tricky, very, very tricky. You find a lot of various different recordings in different places on various media, sometimes transferred to medium, so medium you wouldn't expect to find. So, as I said, it was kind of I just dialed in at 2 a.m. and it was just like, okay, yeah, that's what I'm hearing right now. So, they may have miscited it too. That's not even a possibility. But that's what they claimed, and so I took it at face value. No, I didn't research the recording. No, I didn't do that at all. It was long before I was even in doing theology at the time, so it's just something very interesting to listen to. So, but I do know. Oh yeah, Harry Stark. That's a boy. Isn't that true? Take that comment. Yeah, that is so true. Harry Stark says, unfortunately, not everything is digitized and available on the internet. The University of, if you've ever been in an archive, especially an audio archive, some things are really badly cataloged. If it's cataloged at all. I mean, there's an archive underneath the library at TEDS, Trinity International Divinity School, or Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Most of that stuff isn't cataloged. There's papers under there by Carl Henry, you know, boxes of books that John Warwick Montgomery bought for the college. You know, he burned through their budget getting rare books. He spent it. He spent it like a drunk sailor. He got some amazing collection though. But there's a lot of material in those archives that has never been cataloged. I know that the audio archive at the University of British Columbia, when I was a student, had a very poorly cataloged audio archive. So, you know, it hasn't all been digitized, especially given the amount of material that's out there. And Harry adds, archives in a labyrinth in itself. Yeah, they are. They're sometimes they're nothing more than file boxes on a shelf. Sometimes there's stacks of file boxes. And if you want something, you got to go through them all to find it. Very, very, very difficult. Very difficult to navigate a audio archive. So, again, I don't claim to know where they got it from. I don't even know if they got the claim right, but that's what they claimed. So, anyway, thank you very much for that super chat and the follow-up question, and very much appreciate it. Is there? All right, we'll take that in a moment. 10:32, and we'll get back to the super chat. Francis Dobbs says, sorry that this is a bit off, but there's a tax on Israel right now, and at least one civilian has died. Regardless of your political views, pray for the peace there if you are religious. Yeah, we're told to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Israel. So I would encourage everyone to pray for what's going on over there. Again, this is not about politics. This is about, you know, keeping, you know, people safe. So again, pray for Israel, pray for the peace. And also while you're doing it, pray for Ukraine as well. Okay? They still need your prayers. Things are still bad over there. So I would ask that you would pray for them as well. All right, so back to that super chat. $5 from Jack Ray. Thank you very much for the super chat. Yada yada, and another bonbon question. Okay. Let's see what we have for a bonbon question. Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of questions tonight. He doesn't have his text file open. He said that earlier. So I'm not really sure what we're going to take of his. I think we got the one question he really had that was interesting. Yeah, it's really only the one question he has. Anything comes later. So we'll probably have to take a different question from a different person here. He says there's one question about rising anti-Christian incidents in Israel. I asked it earlier. Okay. What time did he ask it? Okay, well, let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, your chat doesn't go that far back, Bonbon, but mine does. So I just have to find it. Oh, I see it. Okay, it's at 10:01. And he asks, what are your thoughts on the current alleged incidents of some Jews in the Holy Land spitting on Christian visitors and tourists there? I think it's bad behavior. Really? Um, you know, I don't think we should be treating each other that way. I don't think we should be spitting on them or they should be spitting on us. You know, you're supposed to treat each other with love. You know, it says in the Old Testament, even in Torah, you know, love your neighbor. Christians are your neighbor. So, you know, that's it. I mean, it really comes down to that. You know, the two great commandments: love the Lord thy God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And the second commandment is you know, love your neighbor as yourself. So, you know, they're breaking the spirit of Torah by doing this. And I know that for certain Messianic Jews, it's some of that persecution is getting pretty bad. I have heard of say Jews throwing stones at Messianic Jews. So it can get a lot worse than spitting. It can get a lot worse than spitting. But I've seen some of these incidents documented. So I've seen videotapes of them. I've seen videotapes of say, especially Orthodox Jews, or the ultra Orthodox, you know, picking up a stone and then hurling it at a Messianic Jew. And you know, those stones are not. I mean, these are not little pebbles. These are big honking rocks, and you can really hurt someone that way. You know, you can kill them. You can kill somebody like that. Yeah. And then, you know, the fact is too, you know, Israelites were also told to do not persecute the foreigner. You know, because you were once a foreigner in another country. Okay. That also is Torah. You know, here's the thing. The Israelites were meant to be a kingdom of priests showing God to the world. That means that at its core, Israelite religion is supposed to have universal appeal. If you start spitting on people, start throwing rocks at them, that's not a good example of being a priest to the world. So, yeah, I think it's and this sort of thing is on the rise. It is on the rise. As the world here gets more uncertain, as people secularize, we're going to see more and more of these incidents. And it's just going to it's getting worse with time. There's an organization called Voice of the Martyrs, and they have documented the rise of, say, martyrdom, and it's on the increase. It's definitely on the increase. It's not gone away. In fact, martyrdom is as probably as high as it's ever been. So the world is getting less tolerant. The world is getting less tolerant, and it's being shown, you know, to people in their homeland as well as to visitors as well. So, you know, I think the behavior is disgraceful. I think the behavior is disgraceful, and it it doesn't matter who's doing it. It doesn't matter who's doing it to whom. It's still disgraceful behavior. It's not the way we should be behaving. And the fact that it's coming from members of the Abrahamic faiths, that makes this even more disgraceful. So, pray for the persecuted. Pray for the persecuted. That's what I would recommend. So that's my thoughts on that. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for Jack Ray for sponsoring that question. Okay, we're going to take some more non-super chats, and then we're going to call it a night. Because I have got a special occasion to go to tomorrow. So I cannot stay up all night. Yeah, so let's start taking some non-super chats and then calling it. Bible Exegete asks, were Egyptian badly handicapped babies thrown into the Nile? No, they weren't. Egyptians generally abhorred infanticide. They abhorred it. This is one of the things, actually, that Egyptians said this is one of the reasons why they considered people in the Levant to be savages. Because Egyptians would say, oh, these Levantines, they're sacrificing their own child, their own children, whenever we come and, ask for a little bit of tribute from their cities. We ask for tribute and they start sacrificing their kids. So Egyptians abhorred infanticide for any reason. Okay? So, this was one of the things that was so shocking about the behavior of, say, Pharaoh, who killed the Israelite boys. That's that was something that was abhorrent in normal Egyptian society. So it was definitely a move that was that would have been condemned by their own morality, their own moral compass. Bonbon asks, which pharaoh was this? It was probably Ai. It was probably King Ai. Because King Ai, he started that war with the Hittites. He was paranoid. He was creepy. He was a dirtbag. Yeah, he was a dirtbag. So yeah, it was probably King Ai, in all likelihood. So you do get actually, you see some reliefs of some people who had say handicaps. Okay? You do see people with handicaps who actually go on to live productive lives in Egypt. Some are lame, some are have developmental abnormalities. There's even a few places where you see that they're being carried on litters to actually do their jobs. So yeah, it's they didn't do that. They didn't kill infants with defects. But sometimes, again, if you were born with a handicap, your chances of surviving aren't great either. So, that's just one of the things that's true of a late Bronze Age society. Okay. Take that. Non-super chat too. Mechanique asks, is it true that some Jews in Elephantine worshipped Anat? I just heard about this today. Yes. Yes, it is true. They worshipped Anat. They worshipped Balat. They worshipped Mut. That's precious. Yeah. So yeah, they worship all sorts of things they shouldn't have done. They presented wine offerings and incense to these pagan goddesses. So yeah, they did that. Yeah, when I mean, look, Jeremiah warned the Israelites, you go back to Egypt, you're gonna, you're gonna fall back into old Egyptian ways, and that's exactly what happens. That exactly what happens is they go back to Egypt and they start, at first, they're thinking, okay, we're gonna live like pious Jews in Elephantine. So they start by building a temple of Yahweh there. Okay? So they have a complete temple of Yahweh. There's not much left of it anymore, unfortunately, because of the subsidence of the cliff face. But they had a temple of Yahweh there. But they certainly fell into worshiping the local deities, and they did so pretty quickly. So, um, anyway, thank you very much for that question. Very much appreciated. So take some more non-super chats. And okay, I'll take this one from Andrew Graham. Dr. Falk, what are your thoughts on the building of the third temple and the red heifer sacrifice in Numbers 19? Okay. My opinion is that it's going to happen. There will be a third temple. I think that's going to lead to some problems. It's going to lead to some more problems than it actually solves. If they do this, they are going to need a red heifer. They are going to need it because you need that to create. You need to sacrifice that red heifer to create the ashes to do the purification. Now, fortunately, a little ash goes a long ways. So they're going to have to take that. I mean, I think in the entire history of Israelite temple worship, they use, I think, something like 7 heifers. So you don't need one very often. So, but the standards of finding a pure red heifer are really high. There can't be a single white hair on that thing. If they find one white hair, it's disqualified. So, I think it's a really bad idea to build the third temple, but I think it's going to happen. But this is going to create. Well, some of them, there has been proposed using genetic modification to create the red heifer, but yeah, that's again, yeah, that's using man's technology to adhere to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. Because this is supposed to be a sign from God. This is supposed to be a sign from God, not man intervening. Yeah. My producer points out that genetic engineering is generally thought to be a no-no. But it is going to create, as I say, it's going to create huge problems because all that temple ritual is going to start kicking back in. All of it. People are going to have to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem for Passover, and for the Feast of Booths, and for Yom Kippur. Okay, so that's going to require a lot of people moving in and out of Israel. It's going to require people. Yeah, security is going to be a nightmare. Security is going to be an absolute nightmare. It's going to become a magnet for every dirtbag republic out there. It's just going to be Yeah, and Bonbon, you're right. It's not necessarily an exclusive Jewish thing. Christians are going to be exempt from the sin offering, but you know what? It doesn't exempt us from, say, Thanksgiving offerings, oath offerings, those other offerings that are not necessarily covered by the blood of Jesus Christ. So there are some offerings that still would apply to Christian worship, but not as many as that's, and it doesn't require us to do Passover. Okay? That's the other thing, is the Gentile will not be required to go to Jerusalem for Passover. The place is going to stink of blood. It's going to stink of blood. With all those sacrifices happening, it's gonna smell like Mecca at the Hajj. It's gonna smell like Mecca at the Hajj. Because you have to take your lamb up to the Temple Mount and have it ritually killed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's gonna. I mean, there's gonna be rivers of blood flowing from the temple. It's a lot of people are gonna get real sick when they see what real temple rituals look like. You'll have oxen being burnt on the altar. Okay, well, that's gonna make one heck of a I mean, talk about pollution. I mean, you're burning whole bulls on the altar. Harry Stark asks a follow-up question. And here. Yes. Would it even be legal to offer animals in public? I thought animal rights activists would lose it. Oh, they'd totally lose it. Yeah, they totally lose it. But then again, what you're talking about here is publicly sanctioned ritual sacrifice. So, but you can't get out of it if you rebuild the temple. Those mitzvahot, those commandments that govern temple worship are going to all kick in. Even the ones that are sort of kind of ignored now are going to come really back to the forefront. So absolutely, it's going to cause a lot of problems. It's going to cause a lot of issues. Talbot Slade says, the fact that they have a third temple does not mean it's with God's presence. That happens when Jesus returns. Well, we have to remember at the crucifixion too, the veil on the temple tore, and the Shekinah glory left the temple at that point. So, it doesn't. There's no. Here's the thing. It's not commanded in the text to build a third temple, but people don't always do what they're told. So, I don't think that. I mean, yeah, there is going to be that issue. There is definitely going to be that issue that it doesn't. You're not going to get the Shekinah glory back in the temple because it left. It left already, but it doesn't mean it won't return either. So we have to be careful there. Like, for example, if one takes a futurist view of, say, Revelation, you are going to know during, say, the millennial reign that the Shekinah, that the temple will be back, but Christ will be at the center of it, and so will the Shekinah glory. So it's not that it won't ever come back. It's just that it won't immediately come back. Now, Francis Dodd asks, Dr. Falk, why do you think it's likely they'll try to rebuild the temple? Okay. Because in Matthew 25, it warns us of the abomination that makes desolate. And when you see him in the Holy of Holies, let me find the passage here. In the holy place. Where it is. Down here. All right. Matthew 24:15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, I know the preterist at this point is going to say this is talking about the destruction of the first temple. But there was no abomination of desolation standing in the holy place during the destruction of the first temple in 70 AD. Where's the second temple? That's the second temple. Okay? So, this is not an event that occurred historically. And the holy place is really that court of the temple. Okay? You have to have a temple to have a holy place in Israelite context. Yeah, you have to have that. It's a mandatory thing. So, if you have the abomination of desolation, you're going to have that standing in the holy place. Now, there are many types of the abominations that make desolate. Okay, so the one spoken of in Daniel, that's your type. Again, we're getting into typology again. You had guys like Nero, who are another type. You had Vespasian, another type. You had, say, Antiochus Epiphanes, another type. But there's going to be an ultimate fulfillment, which is an anti-type. So here's another suggestion that's basically saying, when you see basically someone who does not belong in that holy place, get the heck out of Dodge. The last time Christians sort of paid attention to this was when Vespasian's army surrounded Jerusalem. Okay, now that was a type again of abomination, people of the prince who is to come. But he also never breached the walls and stood in the holy place. They ran out of town before he actually got there. So, but something like that's going to happen again. Because that's the only way you're going to have something stand in that holy place, is to have that holy place. So that's why, and the only holy place in Israelite culture is the temple on the Temple Mount. So that's my reasoning for thinking that they're going to rebuild it again. Plus, you also have the measurements in, I think it's Ezekiel, where the prophet measures the temple again, and it's a different measurements than they were historically. So for that to be even credible, there's going to have to be a third temple. So I think it's just a matter of time before that happens. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that helped. So the next one here is okay. Alonso Muncie asked the question: do we know what the hieroglyph for Joseph's Egyptian name would have been? we have a very good idea. Jedef Pa'ank. In the, let's just pull up his name here. We'll read it from the Hebrew. Find this quickly. There it is. Okay. Genesis 41:45. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath Paeah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as his wife. Okay. That Zaphanath. It is Jed NF, and then the Paanea is Pa'ank. Okay. So basically, he who is given as the living one. So that's what it means in Egyptian. So we actually have a pretty good idea what this would have looked like in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So the problem is, though, we have very little records of that period. So are we likely to find something with his name on it? Is, well, it's real small. It's a real small, very remote chance. Very remote. Just because that whole area had really poor preservation of documents. So, okay, so anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much. Yeah, the Sade, Dark Blade, the Sade does readily convert to the Janja. So you see a Sade, it's often converted to a Danja. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat, or sorry, the question. Very much appreciated. Down. Yes. Bonbon asks, you said the Egyptians found infanticide to be abominable. Does that include abortion as well? Yes, it does. And then BC asks, would they have had facilities for abortion? No, they didn't. It's not a practice that the Egyptians did. It's a practice you find in Mesopotamia and in Rome and in Venetian settlements, like at Carthage, but it's not something the Egyptians did. Okay. I'll take this next one here from Bonbon as well. What would happen if an arranged marriage was occur in Egypt, like with Joseph, but one of the people didn't like the other person? They can say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and they're divorced. That was it. Nobody in Egypt was compelled to stay in a marriage. Not the women, not the men. A woman... And a divorce very rarely went to the law courts. Property was generally split on a 1/3, 2/3 basis. Men getting the 2/3, the women getting 1/3. And that's because he supplied the house. And the house was considered to be 1/3 of their wealth. Yeah. BC says, divorce in Egypt would be like sneezing. Oh, yeah. Yep. You've got a lot of revolving marriages in Egypt. It was not uncommon to be married 4 or 5 times. We do see that. Quite typical. With their spouses being alive still. So, yeah. The incidence of divorce in Egypt was really high. Because it was very easy to exit a divorce. Real easy to enter into marriage. And there was no stigma. That's the other thing, too. There's no stigma to being a divorced woman in Egypt. So, because there was no stigma, women felt free to enter and exit marriages at will. Yeah, the big thing, though, was children. Children did make marriages much more permanent. Okay? So, I'll also take this one from Bonbon. Also, if a man wanted to get another wife, but his current wife didn't want him to, would she be able to stop him? Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Multiple marriages were generally not permitted. Okay. He would have to basically divorce her to marry again. The only person in Egypt that was allowed to have multiple wives was the king. He's the only person in Egypt allowed to have multiple wives. Now, there is a loophole in all this, which is sometimes if a wife did not have children, a man could purchase a concubine. A concubine is a slave used for procreation. And then it became a result of the concubine's gambit, where if the concubine produced the child first, the man was expected to divorce his wife and marry the concubine, making her the new wife. So while there was always in Egypt, you could only have one wife at a time, there were ways that you could get ejected from a marriage. There was also ways that people were could leave a marriage. So, but it wasn't something that was something enforced by the courts so much, but tradition basically held this sort of rotating monogamy in place. So. Okay, 1107. All right. I'll take that one too, from the Bible Exegete. Amenhotep III married his daughters after his 30th Hebsed festival. Do you think it was a marriage in the real sense or something else? Oh, it's something else. Okay. It's not a marriage in the real sense. It's a marriage in the ritual sense. Okay. One of the things a king had to do was, like, once a year, he had to travel up and down Egypt and visit the temples, doing the rituals of the temples. That temple ritual involved having a wife. Usually it had to be a great wife. Now, one of the things a king could do is, let's say he didn't want another great wife. The first great wife died. She produced an heir and she died. Okay. You now have an heir to the throne. You don't need another great wife. Because they can be a pain in the butt. They're demanding, they're pushy. Yeah, they would make life miserable for your harem. So a lot of kings did not want another great wife. They did not want another great queen. They just didn't want it. But they still had to perform the rituals, which required having a wife who would serve at your side doing the rituals. So what some kings did is they opted to marry their daughter late in life after they already had an heir to help the king perform these rituals. So, and that's what's happened here in the case of Amenhotep III. We also see it happen with Ramses II. He does the same thing for the same reasons. He does it the same thing for the same reasons, which is he's married his daughter Benanat just so he had a partner to do those endless rituals. So this was something that kings did, and it usually was at the end of the life of the king. So once he's got his heirs, he doesn't want any more children. No, he doesn't want to deal with great queen. But he still has to perform those rituals. So this is a marriage for temple ritual's sake, not a temple in the real sake. So there was probably no consummation of the marriage. That was probably not even done. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you for the question. Great question. Ooh. Okay, let's take the one underneath that too. BC. Why did Solomon have so many concubines? Because he signed a lot of treaties. That's why. He controlled the trade routes, all the trade routes through the Levant. He had an absolute stranglehold on all the trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Or, the Levant. So, Jack Ray says, "Oh, great, another great wife." Yeah, that's probably that was. I mean, kings did have to deal with this. I mean, life in a harem was not good. It was not good. There was bickering and infighting and conniving, and it was politics at its worst. These were women who were living in shared quarters. Only the great wife got private quarters. And it created so much jealousy and infighting, not even funny. Yeah, harems are not good places. They are not good places. So why do you have so many? Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Bible exegete. Imagine Leah and Rachel 100 times worse. Oh yeah, totally. That's what harems were like. Okay, so we're gonna getting back to that other question about why did Solomon have so many wives? BC follows up, but wouldn't the treaty wives be considered wives, not concubines? Well, depends on the dowry. Depends on the dowry. Okay. When you had the exchange of wives, you also had the exchange of gifts. Okay. Now, some of this was gold and silver. Some of these were sex partners, concubines, essentially sexual slaves. Okay. That's what a concubine is. So they would receive these as part of the exchange. Okay. So, Solomon had 700 wives because he had treaties with every little molehill town, hamlet out there. Because that's what it took to get the the tariffs reduced on trade goods, was to have a treaty with Solomon. So everyone who wanted to trade had to sort of sign a treaty. So Solomon got 700 wives out of just the treaties. But a lot of these dirtbag kings, threw in a few sex slaves to sweeten the pot. To make sure, people did sign on the dotted line. So, yeah, this was unfortunately a lot of what happened. So that's why, but that's the reason why he had so many to begin with, is the treaty wives and the exchange of gifts that come with the treaty wives. So anyway, I hope that explains it. Thank you very much for the question. I really appreciate it. Oh yeah, well, take that comment when it comes up in a moment here. There's a comment here from BC. They drove a hard bargain. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a negotiation process. There's a negotiation process to these treaties. They don't just sign the first paper that comes across their desk or the first parchment. These negotiations take years. Between, I think, something like that, the peace treaty between Ramses II and the Hittites. There was like the first negotiation of the treaty took something like 4 years. But the exchange of wives took another decade. So these things take a long, long time. Very long time. Yeah. Yeah.
So just burden.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is that angle, but these are okay. We have to also remember though that these, at least the wives, are they're collateral. Yes, they are a burden on the receiving king, but they are important in this diplomatic negotiation. If a king did not have sufficient daughters for his treaties, how do you seal a treaty? The only country that didn't exchange wives was Egypt. Egypt received wives, but they didn't send them out. And in fact, we got one of the Amarna letters that complains that the treaty person negotiating the treaty, sent out a daughter of the king, but they didn't get one in return. So what? Oh, okay. Let's get to that when it comes up. Yeah, it hasn't come up yet. Okay. Bonbon asks, why did Egypt not send wives? Because they were too good for it. I mean, they're dealing with countries that they think are savages. Okay, they're not about to send their women because they don't have to. They don't have to, and they don't want to. So, there was no necessity for Egypt to do it. The only record we ever have of Egypt sending a treaty wife to anyone is to Solomon during the reign of Siamum, and that's a dynasty in severe decline. I mean, that dynasty is at its end. So, that was an extraordinary case. Egyptians almost never did it, just because they looked down on the rest of the world. They had, they were very ethnocentric. They were very ethnocentric. So they wanted to make sure that, that exchange only went one way. And frankly, the Egyptians weren't so much concerned with treaty wives. They weren't so much concerned with them. Because frankly, a lot of kings would rather have married within Egypt. There's a few Egyptian and foreign wives that sort of are highly esteemed in Egypt, but Egyptian women seem to were seen as superior to the wives that come from foreign lands. Now, there are a couple exceptions of this. The daughter of the Hittite king was one exception to this. She becomes a great queen to Ramses II. Okay? So there's a couple exceptions to this, but as a general rule, the Egyptians prefer Egyptian women. So it added to their prestige to accept the treaty wives, did not add to their prestige to send them out. So it's a very, very interesting thing to note, because you do see that, again, that ethnocentric culture there, sort of play out in their selection. They'd rather marry the daughter of a nomarch, a regional governor, than marry a foreign woman. This is just a cultural difference of that. Egyptians were very xenophobic. Very xenophobic. So, well, let's take that question too. BC asks, how were the descendants of all these wives seen? If they weren't murdered, how did they fit into society? That's what a large bureaucracy is for. A lot of them became overseers. A lot of them became, say, ministers of the crown. Some of them became soldiers and generals. They were generally worked into the bureaucracy. Okay? So while they were never in line for the throne, they were seen as people that you could trust to carry out your bidding. So, in general, the descendants of these wives ended up being bureaucrats. Bureaucrats, even we see this even in Israelite culture, where they're called priests to the king. They're essentially government ministers. Okay? So, that's how that happened. Is they were always worked into the bureaucracies. This is what the Egyptians did. The Israelites did the exact same thing. So when they had these large amounts of wives and large amounts of kids, they're all worked into the bureaucracy. Like, for example, in Egypt, we have actually some pretty good biographical data for the children of Ramses II. And he had like 52 sons. The remaining 120 children were daughters, of course. But we see them being worked into the society. So, the crown prince, he's not only just crown prince, he's chief diplomat. He's chief diplomat. Merneptah, he was 13th in line. He shouldn't have had any chance at all of being king. He was so far down the line, that wasn't, the fact he became king at all was just amazing. But before that, he was a general. They worked him into the military. There's one of the sons of Ramses II was a guy by the name of Ramses Nacht. And what he did was he went around Egypt restoring monuments. Again, worked into the bureaucracy. $11, $12. All right, okay. Jack Ray asks a super chat for $5. Thank you for the super chat. Did the Israel kings copy Egyptians in terms of multiple wives? Oh, yeah. They copied everyone. Everyone did this. This was custom all across the ancient Near East. So they're copying the Egyptians on this. They're copying other Levantines. What's its name now? Og's giant bed. Wasn't because he was a big man. Because he had many wives, and when he was doing his he's doing his kingly Olympics every night. Okay? No one needs a 13-foot bed to sleep in. Maybe he has a trampoline, but so anyway, I don't. Let me see. I've got a report here of the stream breaking. Let me just check my statistics. Stream health. Well, stream's doing okay. We're not getting any breakup as far as that goes. No lost packets. There's no lost packets. Okay. Oh, yes. Darkblade asks, what about the ancient Far East? Well, we know the Chinese emperors had harem. Okay? So we know that they did the practice. So we know that Chinese did this. I'm not sure about the Koreans. The Japanese don't seem to have done this, but I don't know. I don't know about the early Japanese emperors if they would have done it or not. We just know the Chinese did. So yeah, they had a harem. But Jack Ray says the stream buffered for about 3 seconds for me a moment ago. Yeah, that might be just from YouTube. ODS Studio is claiming that there is 0 packets lost. We did lose 15 packets from lag, but that's very small. That's pretty normal. So yeah, so it is probably just YouTube. So YouTube will glitch sometimes like that. So okay, so anyway, let's see. We're gonna probably call it a night very soon here, because again, I do have to get up early tomorrow. Just going to take 2 more non-super chats, and then we'll call it a night. Okay. Go to the beginning of the stream here. Come back down. All the way up. See if there's anything up here. If there is, we'll take it, and if not, we'll call it a night. Okay. I'll take this one from Pablo Marquez. He asks, is removing the shoes before a god an Egyptian practice? If so, is it evidence for the Torah? No. No, they didn't remove their shoes. They actually replaced their shoes. What they would do is, after doing their ritual bathing, which is a practice that's both done in Egypt and in Israel, the Egyptians would take off anything made of animal products. So all the leather had to be taken off, so they took off their leather sandals, and they would replace them with papyrus sandals. These temporary sandals that they would then use to go into the temple. So they didn't walk in the temple barefoot, but they did have these papyrus sandals that they would wear inside of the temple. Because frankly, you stub your toe on a ritual stair, that could hurt. And there's a lot of stone in a temple to stub your toe on. Not to mention the leprosy. We won't get into leprosy. Yeah, so they didn't remove their sandals before their gods. But they did wear sandals, papyrus sandals. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you for that question. It's a good question. We'll take one more, and then we're going to call it a night. I'm going to take this last one, and this will be the last non-super chat of the night. It's going to be from Talitha Kum. And she asks, is Hur, the father of Uri, the same Hur who helped hold Moses' arm up during that one battle? Yes, same guy. Hur here is basically Horus. It's the name of Horus. It's actually an Egyptian name, which is very interesting this is one of the examples of someone from the tribe of Judah having that Egyptian name. So, you sometimes hear that only Levites had Egyptian names. Here's an example of a Judahite that had an Egyptian name. So yeah, it's the same guy. He, after Aaron, Hur is the most powerful man in Israel. Absolutely the most powerful man in Israel. And he has an important role to play in, say, the Exodus and the Israelite culture. So yeah, it's the same guy. It's the same guy. So anyway, that's going to be our final question for the night. So see, we know no more super chats, and we're going to call it a night here. So anyway, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the people who supported us with super chats and donations. We really, really appreciate your support. That helps us get closer to doing this full time. It also keeps food on our table. We rely on that income to keep us going and keep doing these live streams. We really appreciate your help, and we are so grateful. We also want to thank our Patreon subscribers and our YouTube members. And want to thank Jack Ray for providing so many memberships. We really appreciate that. It also helps us keep the lights on and the equipment running. We also want to thank our regular subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed already, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. With that said, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.